The October wind that swept through Silver Fork was a storyteller. It carried the scent of pine dust from the high slopes of the Absarokas and the sharp promise of an early snow. It was a restless wind, whipping down the two-packed dirt streets of the town, rattling the false fronts of the buildings and making the sign for Morrison's Mercantile creak on its hinges like a complaining old man. The dust it raised was fine and persistent, settling on hat brims and window ledges, a constant reminder that civilization here was a thin coat painted over a wild and unyielding land. This was 1887, more than 20 years since the Great War had ended. But out here, the battles were still fought daily against solitude, against the weather, and against the thirst of the land itself. Eli Ward swung down from his saddle, his movements economical and sure. At 34, he had the lean, hard look of a man shaped by the very landscape he worked. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the distance, not from laughter. He tied his horse to the hitching rail in front of the Mercantile, giving the knot a practiced tug. He felt the town's eyes on him, a familiar sensation that he neither encouraged nor avoided. He was a known quantity in Silver Fork, the solitary owner of the Ward Ranch, a man who kept to himself, and, as the town's persistent gossip would have it, the cowboy who had turned down every sweet bride in the county. The bell above the Mercantile door jingled, announcing his arrival into a world of competing smells: coffee beans, cured leather, kerosene, and Tom Morrison's pipe tobacco. Morrison, a man whose round belly was a testament to a life lived behind a counter rather than in a saddle, looked up from the ledger he was studying. "Eli," he greeted, his voice a friendly rumble. "That wind trying to blow you all the way to Wyoming?" "It can try," Eli said, his voice a low drawl that seemed to absorb sound rather than project it. He handed a list across the counter. "Got these things for me." "Tom." Morrison adjusted his spectacles and scanned the paper. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. The usual. "Preparing to hole up for the winter already?" "Winter prepares for itself. I just try to be ready when it arrives." As Morrison began gathering the items, another rancher, Pete Sawyer, clapped Eli on the shoulder. Pete was a good neighbor, a man with a ready smile and a disposition as open as the range. "Heard Jack Brennan's been nosing around the South Fork of your creek again. Eli." Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Brennan's always nosing around somewhere he doesn't belong." Jack Brennan's ranch was large and his ambition larger. In a land where water rights were more precious than gold, a man like Brennan was a constant, simmering threat. "Just watch yourself," Pete said, his friendly tone taking on a serious edge. "The law in this town bends whichever way Brennan's money is blowing." Eli just nodded. He knew. It was one more thing to be watchful for, another storm gathering on the horizon. He paid for his goods, his mind already on the ride back, on the chores that awaited him. The silence of his ranch was both a comfort and a burden. As he loaded the heavy sacks of flour and sugar onto his pack mule, he saw Tom Morrison step out onto the porch, looking down the street. "Well, I'll be," the storekeeper murmured. "Looks like the stage brought something more than the mail." Eli followed his gaze. A rickety wagon, pulled by a single tired horse, had just halted at the far end of the street. It was a sorry-looking outfit, coated in the dust of a long journey. A woman was climbing down, her movement stiff but deliberate. She wore a plain, dark dress, practical for travel, and her face was obscured by a bonnet. 2 children followed her. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, slid down from the wagon bed, his posture straight and unnervingly adult as he scanned the unfamiliar town. Then a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, was helped down by her mother. They were an island of uncertainty in the middle of the street. The boy, Tom, stood close to his mother, a silent guard. The little girl, Alice, clung to her mother's skirt, her wide eyes taking in the strange, windy place. The woman, Miriam Lane, stood for a long moment, simply looking, her gaze sweeping over the dusty storefronts, the saloon, the blacksmith's shop, as if she were taking the measure of the entire town. There was no desperation in her stance, only a quiet, resolute appraisal. She was a woman who had clearly seen hardship but had not been broken by it. Eli finished tying down his load. He told himself it was none of his business. People came and went. Most didn't last a winter. This family, with their meager wagon and exhausted horse, seemed less likely than most. Yet he lingered, his hand resting on the mule's flank. The wind picked up again, tugging at the woman's bonnet and whipping strands of brown hair across her face. She pushed them back with a weary gesture, and then, for a reason he could not name, she turned her head and her eyes met his across the dusty expanse. It was not a glance of invitation or of pleading. It was a look of profound stillness, a moment of direct, unadorned recognition. He saw in her eyes the same practicality and resilience he valued in himself. He saw the weight of responsibility and the quiet strength it took to bear it. For a fraction of a second, the wind and the whispers of the town fell away, and there was only the silent communication between two people who understood the harsh arithmetic of survival. Then the moment was gone. She turned back to her children, her voice too low for him to hear, and began walking toward the mercantile. Eli swung himself into his saddle, nudged his horse into motion, and rode out of town without a backward glance. But the image of her face, calm and steady in the relentless wind, followed him. The ride home was a familiar comfort. The trail wound up through the foothills, leaving the small cluster of buildings behind. The air grew cleaner, sharper, scented with the raw perfume of the pines. This was his sanctuary, the land that asked everything of him and, in return, gave him a sense of purpose that the world of men never could. He passed the boundary marker of his property, a simple post driven into the earth. Everything within that boundary was his responsibility. The cattle grazing on the autumn grass, the fences that needed mending, the creek that was his lifeblood. His house stood in a small clearing, sheltered by a stand of tall ponderosas. It was a solid, well-built structure of hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a deep porch. He had built it himself, built it to last. But as he approached, it looked more solitary than solid. Smoke did not curl from the chimney. No light warmed the windows. It was a shell, a place to sleep and eat. Not a home. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under his boots and the sighing of the wind in the chimney. He unpacked his supplies with methodical efficiency, storing the flour and sugar in pest-proof bins, placing the tins of coffee on a shelf. Every object had its place. The order was a defense against the chaos of the world, against the unpredictability of memory. He had not always been alone. There was a time when this house had held laughter, when the scent of baking bread had filled these rooms, when a smaller hand had rested in his. But loss was a thief that came in the night, and it had stolen the heart from this house, leaving only a hollow echo. He had sworn an oath to himself then, a silent vow made in the depths of grief. He would never again give fate a target. He would never again risk that kind of pain. Independence was his armor. Solitude was his fortress. The women of the county, with their hopeful smiles and their mother's ambitions, had seen the walls but had never understood the reason for them. They saw a handsome rancher with a fine piece of land. They did not see the ghost that walked beside him. He made himself a simple supper of bacon and beans and sat at the long wooden table he had built for a family he no longer had. The house groaned around him as the temperature dropped. The wind moaned, a lonely sound that found its way through the chinks in the logs. On nights like this, the silence was loudest. It was a physical presence, a weight in the room. He told himself it was peace. He told himself it was freedom. But as he looked at the empty chairs pushed up to the table, a different word came to mind, a word he rarely allowed himself to think: lonely. Back in Silver Fork, Miriam Lane stood before Tom Morrison's counter. Her son stood beside her, his hand resting on the handle of a small axe tucked into his belt, a gesture that was both boyish and deadly serious. Alice was behind her, her small hand clutching a fold of her mother's dress, her eyes wide as she took in the strange new world of the mercantile, a cavern of shadows and shapes, of barrels and crates stacked to the ceiling. "Good evening, ma'am," Morrison said, his professional curiosity softened by a natural kindness. "Long road." "Long enough," Miriam replied. Her voice was steady, without a trace of self-pity. "I was told there might be work to be had in this area, or a small plot of land to be leased for the winter." Morrison slowly polished the counter with a cloth. He had seen this story before: a husband lost to fever, or a mine collapse, or just the simple, grinding hardship of the frontier, a widow left with nothing but children and a desperate hope. Usually, that hope was a fragile thing, but there was something different about this woman, a core of steel beneath the weary exterior. "Land is tight," he said honestly. "And work for a woman? Well, it's mostly mending and washing for the saloon hands, not much dignity in it, and less pay." He paused, then added, "Dr. Whitaker sometimes needs a hand, but his wife manages most of his needs." Miriam nodded, absorbing the information without visible disappointment. "I see. And the ranchers? Do they need help in the kitchens or with winter preparations?" Here it was, the question he had been expecting. Morrison thought of the sprawling Brennan Ranch, with its rough bunkhouse and rougher foremen. He thought of the smaller outfits, most of them with wives who managed their own households with fierce pride. And then he thought of the one ranch where there was no wife, the one house that was clean but cold, the one man who needed help but would never, ever ask for it. "Most folks are family operations," he said carefully. "There is one man, Eli Ward. He has a fine spread north of here, keeps to himself mostly. He couldn't stop the bit of town gossip from slipping out. Folks say he's not much for company, especially the female kind." Miriam's expression didn't change. She was gathering facts, not opinions. "Is he an honest man?" The question was direct, stripping away all the rumor and speculation. Tom Morrison considered it. Eli Ward was quiet. Yes, he was private to the point of being a hermit, but was he honest? "As the day is long," Morrison said, with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Pays his debts. Never cheats a man. His word is his bond. And he lives alone." "Completely." Miriam was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. Her son, Tom, watched the storekeeper, his young face set in a protective scowl. His mother had taught him to be wary, to listen more than he spoke. He had seen the way men looked at his mother, sometimes with pity, sometimes with a different kind of interest that made his fists clench. He didn't trust any of them. Finally, Miriam's focus returned to the present. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Morrison. You have been very helpful." She bought a small bag of oats for her horse and a loaf of bread, paying from a worn coin purse that held precious few coins. As she turned to leave, her youngest, Alice, who had been silent the entire time, pointed a small finger toward a wooden bucket near the door. It was filled with cheap, shiny rocks that Morrison kept to amuse the children who came into the store. Most of them were just colorful river stones, but mixed in were a few pieces of pyrite, fool's gold. "Mama, look," she whispered. "A star." Miriam followed her gaze, and a rare, gentle smile touched her lips. She looked at Morrison, a silent question in her eyes. "Go on, little one," the storekeeper said, his voice gruff. "Take one, for good luck." Alice carefully selected a small, sharp-edged piece of pyrite. It glittered in the lantern light, a tiny spark of brilliance against the dusty floorboards. She clutched it in her hand as if it were a real treasure. It was a small, bright thing in a dark and uncertain world. A promise, perhaps, that even in the dustiest corners, you could sometimes find a flicker of light. They stepped back out into the wind. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple. The town was settling in for the night. Lights began to appear in windows. The sound of a piano drifted tinny and distant from the saloon. Miriam Lane stood on the boardwalk, her children beside her, the piece of fool's gold tight in her daughter's hand. She looked north, in the direction of Eli Ward's ranch. She had what she needed: a name, a direction, and the knowledge that the man was honest. In this world, that was more than enough to build a plan on. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, a cold and insistent reminder of the coming winter. But for the first time since she had set foot in Silver Fork, she felt not a chill of fear, but the faintest glimmer of hope. Miriam Lane did not believe in luck, but she believed in information. For 2 days, she moved through the small world of Silver Fork with quiet purpose, her ears open and her mouth closed. She spent her last coins on a small room behind the livery, a space that smelled of hay and horse liniment, but it was shelter. From this temporary base, she learned the rhythms of the town. She learned that the blacksmith was an honest man, but prone to drink after sundown. She learned that the banker held 3 mortgages on failing ranches and was looking for a 4th. She learned which wives complained about their husbands and which ones defended them with a fierce, quiet pride. She spent most of her time in Morrison's mercantile, nursing a single cup of coffee, mister. Morrison gave her on credit, listening. The store was the town's heart, and gossip was the blood that pumped through it. The men talked of cattle prices, of the coming railroad, and of Jack Brennan's insatiable appetite for land and water. The women talked of putting up preserves for winter, of the price of wool, and of the solitary, stubborn man who lived to the north. She built a ledger in her mind. Some men were quick to anger, their tempers flashing like dry lightning. Others were weak-willed, their kindness a flimsy cover for an inability to make a hard choice. She mentally crossed them off her list. Then there was Eli Ward. The stories about him were consistent. He was a man who kept his word. He was fiercely private. He worked harder than any 2 men in the county, and he wanted to be left alone. In her stark calculus of survival, these were not faults. They were assets. A man who wanted to be left alone was not a man who would make unwanted advances. A man whose word was his bond would not break an agreement. A hard worker would respect hard work in others. She made her assessment. In a world of risks, Eli Ward was the lowest she was likely to find. 3 days after her arrival, Eli rode back into town. He had broken a rein buckle and needed a replacement. He did not plan on staying long. As he dismounted in front of the mercantile, he saw her. She was standing on the boardwalk, speaking with Tom Morrison. Her children were nearby. The boy was examining the hinges on the door with a serious expression, and the girl was sitting on an overturned barrel, humming softly to herself. Eli gave a curt nod as he passed, his eyes fixed on the door. He felt a familiar defensiveness rise in him. The town was small, and he knew that this woman's arrival and their brief exchange of looks had likely been woven into the tapestry of local rumor. Inside, Morrison greeted him, the storekeeper, a man who missed nothing, gestured with his head toward the woman outside. He mentioned that Mrs. Lane was a widow, looking for a way to get through the winter. He said it in a low, suggestive tone, the voice of a man trying to play matchmaker. Eli's response was a flat, dismissive sound. He stated that it was a hard country, and that many people tried to make a go of it and failed. His meaning was clear, intended to end the conversation. He paid for the new buckle and turned to leave. Miriam was standing just inside the doorway. Having stepped in to escape a sudden gust of wind, they were face to face, the small space suddenly charged with an unspoken tension. She did not flinch from his cold gaze. She looked at him directly, her own expression one of weary but unbreakable resolve. She told him, her voice clear and steady enough for Morrison and a few others to hear, that she was not a stranger to hard country or hard work. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. The directness of it surprised him. He was accustomed to women being either overly friendly or timid in his presence. This woman was neither. She was simply present. a fact as solid and unadorned as a block of granite. She then asked if she might have a word with him in private. The request was so unexpected that for a moment he did not know how to respond. He was a man who avoided private words with anyone, let alone a stranger, a woman, before he could refuse. She suggested they could speak somewhere out in the open, whenever he had a moment. Something in her practical, no-nonsense approach cut through his defenses. He found himself agreeing, though his own voice sounded foreign to him. He told her where the trail to his ranch met the main creek, where a grove of old cottonwoods stood. It was his place, a spot he went to think. He told her to meet him there the next afternoon. He did not know why he had offered this small piece of himself, only that she was the first person in a very long time who had made him feel that a simple refusal was not enough. The next day, he was there first. The creek flowed steadily, its surface reflecting the pale blue of the autumn sky. The last of the yellow leaves clung to the cottonwood branches, trembling in the breeze. The air was clean and cold. This was his world, governed by the seasons and the flow of water, not by the complicated demands of people. He saw them coming from a distance, 3 small figures walking up the trail. Miriam led the way, her stride even and determined. Tom walked beside her, his shoulders back. Alice trailed just behind, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch her mother's dress. Their arrival was quiet, almost a part of the landscape. They did not intrude on the silence. They simply joined it. Miriam stopped a respectful distance away. She did not offer pleasantries about the weather or the beauty of the spot. She was a woman who did not have time for such things. She stated her purpose directly. She was looking for work in exchange for shelter for the winter. She listed her skills calmly. She could cook, clean, mend, and manage a root cellar and pantry. She knew how to garden and preserve the harvest. She could make soap and candles. She presented her abilities not as virtues, but as a set of tools she was offering for trade. Eli listened, his arms crossed over his chest. His mind, the practical part of him, acknowledged the truth in her offer. His house was clean but stark. His meals were functional but joyless. His clothes were mended with clumsy bachelor stitches. Her proposal made a cold, logical sense, but the other part of him, the part that had sworn a vow of solitude, resisted. He tested her, wanting to be sure she understood the reality of what she was asking for. He spoke of the isolation, of weeks on end without seeing another soul. He described the biting cold of a Montana winter, the snow that could pile up to the eaves of the house, the relentless work of keeping animals alive when the world was frozen solid. He told her he was a man of routine, set in his ways. He did not want conversation. He did not want complications. He was offering a business arrangement, nothing more. Miriam heard him out without interruption. Her gaze never wavered. When he was finished, her answer was simple. She declared that they could do the work. Then the boy, Tom, took a step forward. He was young, but his eyes held the gravity of a man. He looked directly at Eli, his chin lifted in a show of pride that was both touching and impressive. He said he was not asking for charity. He was asking for a job. He listed his own capabilities, that he could chop wood, help with the livestock, and that he was a fast learner. The boy's dignity struck a chord in Eli. He saw a reflection of himself at that age, a boy forced by circumstance to become a man too soon. He found he could not dismiss the boy's pride. While the adults spoke, Alice had wandered over to the edge of the creek. She was not listening to their serious talk. Her attention was captured by the smooth, water-tumbled stones in the shallows. She bent down and picked one up, a piece of milky white quartz, cool and solid in her small hand. She held it up for her mother to see, a small, silent offering of beauty in the middle of their tense negotiation. Eli's gaze shifted from the boy's defiant face to the girl's innocent one. He looked at Miriam, at the lines of exhaustion and determination etched around her eyes. He saw them not as a threat to his solitude, but as a self-contained unit of survival, as fiercely independent in their own way as he was in his. His fortress had been built to keep out the world, but these three people were not the world. They were just a family with nowhere else to go. He made his decision. He told them his terms. 1 month, a trial. They would work for 1 month. If the arrangement was suitable for all of them, they could stay for the winter. If it was not, they would part ways before the first heavy snow, with no blame on either side. Miriam considered his offer. The terms were harsh, but they were fair. She agreed. She held out her hand. He hesitated for a second before taking it. His hand was large and rough, the skin thickened and scarred by years of work with rope and leather and wood. Hers was smaller, but it was not soft. The palm was calloused, the fingers strong. It was the hand of a woman who had known labor. As their hands met, it was not a gesture of intimacy, but of mutual understanding. It was a handshake between two practical people, sealing a contract born of necessity. The touch was brief, firm, and respectful. He gave them directions to the ranch house, which was just over the next rise. He told them he would ride ahead. As he swung into his saddle, he saw Miriam turn to her children. He saw the boy, Tom, straighten his shoulders, the responsibility of their new chance settling upon him. He saw the little girl, Alice, slip the white stone into her pocket. He rode away without looking back, the familiar creak of his saddle a comforting sound. He pushed his horse into a steady trot. His mind focused on the trail ahead, but as he rode, a strange feeling began to settle over him. He thought of his house, of the deep, profound silence that always greeted him. For years, that silence had been his shield, his comfort. But today, the thought of it was different. He found himself imagining the sound of a door opening, the murmur of a voice, the soft tread of footsteps on the wooden floor. For the first time since he had built his walls, he found he did not want the house to be silent. He did not want to be alone. And that thought, more than the arrival of any stranger, unsettled him to his very core. He had agreed to 1 month. He told himself it was just a business arrangement, a temporary convenience. But as he crested the rise and saw his empty house waiting for him in the long afternoon shadows, a small, treacherous part of him hoped it would be longer. The first morning light found Eli already awake. He lay in his bed, listening. For a decade, the only sounds that greeted him at dawn were the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Now, there were other noises. The soft thud of a boot on the floorboards in the room he had given to the boy, Tom. A faint, almost inaudible murmur from the small attic space where Miriam and Alice had made their beds. He smelled coffee, but it was not the harsh, boiled brew he made for himself. This was a gentler aroma, less of a command to wake up and more of an invitation. He rose and dressed, his movement stiff. A routine of years had been disrupted. He felt like a stranger in his own house. When he entered the main room, Miriam was already at the stove, a simple apron tied over her dress. A fire was crackling in the hearth, chasing the chill from the corners of the room. The children were seated at the long table, a slice of yesterday's bread before each of them. They looked up as he entered, their expressions guarded. Miriam turned from the stove. She was not smiling, but her eyes were clear and direct. She informed him that there was coffee and that she had found a small amount of oatmeal in the back of the pantry. She said it as if she were giving a report to a commanding officer. The efficiency of it was both a relief and a source of profound unease. He had expected. He did not know what he had expected. Tears, perhaps helplessness, the cloying neediness he had seen in other women. He had not expected this quiet competence, this sense of order being imposed on his deliberate solitude. He told her they would need to go into town. It was market day, and with 3 more mouths to feed, his own winter stores would not be sufficient. He needed more salt for curing meat, more flour, more of everything. He also stated that she would know best what a proper kitchen required. He said it gruffly, as if he were assigning a distasteful chore. An hour later, they were rattling toward Silver Fork in his buckboard. He had insisted on taking it rather than her tired wagon. He sat at the reins, his posture rigid. Miriam sat beside him, a space of unbreachable air between them. Tom and Alice rode in the back, silent observers of the vast, rolling landscape. The news of their arrangement had traveled faster than a prairie fire. As they pulled up near the market stalls, a hush fell over the usual Saturday morning clamor. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, then resumed in hushed whispers. Eli felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He was a landmark in this county, a fixed point of solitude. To see him now, with a woman and 2 children in his wagon, was as jarring as seeing a mountain suddenly shift its position on the horizon. He saw them in the crowd, the women he had politely, but firmly, kept at a distance over the years. Some were married now, with children of their own. Others were still single, their hopeful glances now curdled into a sharp, assessing curiosity. They stood in small clusters, their bonnets tilted together like plotting birds. Miriam seemed oblivious to the stares, or if she was not, she gave no sign. Her focus was absolute. She moved from stall to stall with a brisk, discerning eye. She was not there for ribbons or lace. She bartered for 3 laying hens, her hands expertly checking their health. She examined a bolt of thick wool flannel, calculating its warmth against its price. She bought a large block of rock salt and a sack of winter potatoes, her decisions swift and practical. Eli stood back, holding a heavy sack of flour over one shoulder. He watched her, and a strange, disorienting feeling washed over him. He felt like an actor in a play he had not rehearsed. The image they presented a man, a woman, 2 children. Stocking up for the winter was one of domesticity, of family. It was a life he had once known and had violently walled off. To be standing in the middle of it again felt like a betrayal of his own grief, of the vow he had made to himself. He was flustered, his usual stoic calm fracturing under the pressure of the town's gaze and the unfamiliar role he seemed to be playing. As Miriam was paying the farmer for the chickens, a woman stepped forward. It was Mrs. Gable, a rancher's wife whose daughter Eli had once taken to a church social and never called upon again. Mrs. Gable had a smile as thin and sharp as a shard of ice. She looked Miriam up and down, her gaze lingering on her worn dress. Then she looked past her, directly at Eli. She addressed her words to Miriam, but they were meant for him, and for the entire listening town. Well, she said, her voice carrying in the quiet air. Another woman trying her luck. I suppose every soul in the county has to have a go at the man who refuses them all. The insult was plain, a public branding of Miriam as just one more in a long line of failures. A flicker of anger, hot and protective, surged in Eli before he could speak, to say something that would cut the woman down. Miriam turned. She did not look angry. She did not look humiliated. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She turned her head slightly, to where Eli stood frozen by the wagon. Her voice was low, not meant for the crowd, but for him alone. It was as clear and precise as the strike of a hammer on an anvil. A cowboy turned down every sweet bride in the county, she said, her eyes holding his, until one gentle woman broke his vows forever. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was not a boast. It was not a declaration of victory. It was a challenge, delivered with a surgeon's skill. She was not talking about breaking his vow to stay single. She was talking about his deeper, unspoken vow, the vow to not feel, to not risk, to not live, in one quiet sentence, in the middle of the crowded market. She had looked past the walls of his fortress and seen the prisoner huddled inside. She had seen his wound, and she had just told him it was time for it to heal. He had no response. He could only stare at her, the noise of the market fading to a distant buzz. He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew she had hit her mark. Without another word, she picked up her basket of goods and turned toward the wagon, leaving Mrs. Gable speechless and the rest of the town to its bewildered whispers. The ride back to the ranch was silent for the first few miles. The tension in the wagon was thick enough to be a passenger. Eli's mind reeled. Playing her words over and over again broke his vows forever. It was a prophecy and an accusation all at once. Finally, as the town disappeared behind them, he cleared his throat. He felt an overwhelming need to break the silence, to return to the safe, neutral ground of practical matters. He gestured with his chin toward the coffee tin at Miriam's feet. "That coffee you made this morning," he said, his voice rough. "It wasn't half bad. Mine usually has enough grit in it to scour a skillet." A small smile touched her lips. She looked out at the rolling hills. "A man who works as hard as you deserves a decent cup of coffee. It is one of the few civilized things a body can count on." "Not much else is civilized out here," he admitted. The conversation felt strange, but also strangely easy. "No," she agreed. "Even the wind has poor manners. In Montana, it seems the wind has a habit of walking right into your house like a nosy neighbor who was not invited." He let out a short, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. The image was perfect, and it usually has just as much to say for itself. The tension was broken. They talked more on the way back. Easy words about the weather, about the best way to store potatoes, about the stubborn nature of mules. It was the most he had spoken to another adult in months. And he found, to his surprise, that it was not the burden he had always imagined it would be. When they arrived back at the house, the feeling had shifted. It was no longer just his house, with temporary lodgers. It felt like they were returning to a shared place. As Tom helped him unhitch the team, Miriam and Alice went inside. Later, when he came in from the barn, he found Miriam in the kitchen. She had wiped down all the shelves and was methodically organizing the new supplies. She moved with a quiet grace, bringing order to a space that had only ever known his own gruff functionality. She opened a low cupboard, one he rarely used, and paused. She reached inside and pulled out a small, linen dish towel. It was yellowed with age, but on one corner was a small, delicately embroidered bluebird. He froze in the doorway. He had not seen that towel in 10 years. It had been his wife's. He had packed away all her things, all the small, feminine touches she had brought to this house, unable to bear the sight of them. But he had missed this one. He expected a flood of pain. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace as he watched Miriam fold the towel neatly and hang it from a hook by the dry sink. She had not asked. She had not made a show of it. She had simply found something useful and beautiful and put it to work. The small bluebird seemed to take flight in the dim light of the kitchen. With that one simple act, a bit of warmth, a breath of a life long past. Returned to the room. The house did not feel haunted. For the first time, it felt whole. That evening, after a supper of stew that filled the house with a rich, savory aroma, he knew he had to reestablish the lines of their agreement. He felt things shifting too quickly, becoming something he could not control. He sat at the table as Miriam cleaned up. He laid out his terms, his voice more formal than it needed to be. He told her his work required his full attention. He needed his privacy. Their arrangement was for the winter. It came with no expectations, no promises for the spring. He needed her to understand that. He was offering a roof and food, not a future. Miriam listened, her hands still in the soapy water. When he was finished, she dried her hands on her apron and faced him. She accepted his terms. She said she understood them completely. But, she added, she had terms of her own. Her voice was quiet but firm. While they were under his roof, there would be respect. There would be no harsh words used toward her or her children. There would be no violence. And there would be no drunken behavior in the house. Her children had seen enough of that in their lives. She required a safe place for them. That was her price. He looked at her, at this woman who had nothing, who was dictating terms to him in his own home, and he felt nothing but a profound sense of respect. He agreed. He gave his word. Later that night, the house was quiet again. A different kind of quiet. Not the empty, echoing silence he was used to, but a settled quiet, the sound of a house at rest. He lay in his bed, the book he had been trying to read lying open on his chest. He could hear the wind outside, the nosy neighbor, whispering at the eaves. And then another sound drifted through the walls. It was faint, a soft, melodic murmur. It was Miriam's voice, telling Alice a story. He could not make out the words, only the gentle cadence, the rise and fall of her voice as she spun a tale to soothe the child to sleep. The sound wrapped itself around the core of his loneliness and squeezed. It was the sound of a mother, the sound of a family, the sound of a home. He closed his eyes. It is just a job, he told himself, repeating the words like a prayer. It is just a business arrangement. But as the soft murmur of her voice finally faded into the peaceful silence of a sleeping house, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was lying to himself. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated not by a clock but by the rising and setting of the sun. The arrangement, born of necessity, began to take on the shape of something else, something solid and real. It was a structure built of shared labor. In the mornings, Eli would head to the barn, and he would find Tom already there, waiting. The boy was a shadow, quiet and observant, his eyes missing nothing. Eli, a man who had never thought of himself as a teacher, found himself speaking more than he had in years, his words spare and practical, a language of work. He showed Tom how to read the clouds, to see the mare's tails that spoke of wind and the heavy, bruised underbellies that promised a storm. He taught him the art of rope, not just the simple knots for tying down a load, but the essential ones, the bowline that would not slip, the clove hitch that would hold fast. He would pass the rope to the boy and say, "A knot is a promise. You have to be able to trust it." Even in the dark, Tom would practice for hours, his young fingers fumbling at first, then growing sure and quick, until the rope became an extension of his will. The trust being built was not just in the knots. Inside the house, a similar transformation was taking place. Miriam moved through the rooms with a quiet efficiency that was a force of nature in itself. She did not change things so much as she woke them up. The kitchen, once a place of stark function, became the heart of the house. The scent of baking bread replaced the cold smell of wood smoke. A pot of something savory was always simmering on the back of the stove, a silent promise of a warm meal at the end of a long day. The house began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home, its timbers warmed by the steady flame in the hearth. One afternoon, the sky turned a strange, yellowish gray. Eli, who had been mending a harness on the porch, looked up and his face hardened. He had seen skies like this before. He called out, his voice sharp with an urgency that made them all stop. He told them to get inside, to bring the chickens into the small shed, to secure the shutters. There was no time to ask questions. The air had become unnaturally still, the world holding its breath. They were all in the main room when the first stone hit the roof. It was a sound like a gunshot. Alice cried out and ran to her mother, then another, and soon it was a deafening roar, a relentless, violent drumming as hailstones the size of hen's eggs battered the house. The noise was terrifying, a sound of pure destruction. It felt as if the world were being torn apart. The house, which Eli had built with his own 2 hands, groaned under the assault. The log walls creaked, the windows rattled in their frames. Alice was sobbing, her face buried in Miriam's dress. Eli saw the terror in the little girl's eyes. He moved closer, kneeling down so he was at her level. The noise was so loud he had to almost shout to be heard. He pointed to the heavy ceiling beams. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. "You hear the house making all that noise?" Alice, trembling, could only nod. "That is the sound of the house fighting," he said, his expression serious. "The logs are groaning because they are holding strong. The roof is rattling because it is throwing the ice back at the sky. This house is a good fighter. It is working hard to keep us safe." The little girl looked from Eli's calm face to the sturdy walls around them. Her sobs began to subside. She was still frightened, but a new understanding dawned in her eyes. They were not just victims of the storm. They were being protected. She leaned against her mother, her small hand clutching the piece of quartz in her pocket, and watched the man who seemed as solid and unmovable as the house itself. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world that was battered and bruised. The ground was white with ice. The vegetable garden Miriam had started to tend was shredded. The roof of the chicken coop had a gaping hole in it, and the main gate to the corral was hanging from a single hinge. But the storm had forged something new among them. When they stepped outside into the cold, clean air, they were no longer 4 individuals living under one roof. They were a unit. Without a word being spoken, they set to work. Eli climbed onto the roof of the coop to assess the damage. Tom, unasked, began gathering the tools. Miriam, after checking on her hens, started clearing the debris from the garden, her movements swift and determined. They spent the rest of the day making repairs, working together in a seamless, unspoken partnership. Tom, hammering nails with a steady hand, felt a surge of pride. He was not just a boy being sheltered. He was a man contributing, rebuilding. Miriam, calculating their remaining food stores and rationing their supplies for the lean times ahead, felt a sense of purpose she had not known in years. She was not just a widow seeking refuge. She was a partner, ensuring their collective survival. As Eli worked beside the boy, showing him how to brace the broken gate, he heard himself say, "We will need to check the fence line in the south pasture tomorrow, see if any posts are down." The word hung in the air between them. It was a word he had not used in a long, long time. He had thought only in terms of I and my ranch, my work, my solitude. The small, simple word felt both strange and natural on his tongue. It was the sound of a wall beginning to crumble. A few days later, Eli knew it was time. The hailstorm had cost them. Some of their winter stores had been damaged, and the hunting would have to be more frequent to make up for the loss. He brought his rifle down from the pegs above the fireplace. It was a tool he respected, a heavy, well-oiled piece of machinery that he kept in perfect working order. He was cleaning it at the long table when Tom came in from the barn. At the sight of the rifle, the boy froze. A shadow passed over his face, and the color drained from his cheeks. He took an involuntary step backward, his eyes wide with a fear that was old and deep. Eli saw the reaction and put the cleaning cloth down. He did not speak. He simply watched the boy, his expression unreadable. Miriam entered the room, and her gaze went from the rifle to her son's pale face. A look of pain and understanding passed between them. Later, when the children were outside, she spoke to Eli in a low voice. She explained that Tom's father had been a man who found his courage in a bottle. She did not need to say more. Eli understood. A firearm in the hands of a man like that was not a tool for hunting. It was an instrument of fear. The next afternoon, Eli took the rifle and a small box of cartridges and walked out to a clearing a short distance from the house. He did not ask Tom to come. He simply started walking, knowing the boy would follow. Tom kept his distance, his movements hesitant, his face a mask of conflict. Eli set up a target, an old tin can on a fence post. He did not look at Tom. He spoke to the air, his voice calm and even. He talked about the rifle, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. He explained how it worked, the simple, precise mechanics of it. He spoke of respect, of knowing your tool, of never pointing it at anything you did not intend to shoot. He loaded a single cartridge and raised the rifle to his shoulder. He took his time, his movements slow and deliberate. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the trees, and the tin can jumped off the post, He reloaded and then, without turning, he held the rifle out. "Your turn," he said quietly. Tom stood rooted to the spot, his whole body trembling. "I cannot," he whispered, the words barely audible. Eli lowered the rifle but did not move closer. "I am not asking you to be your father," he said, his voice softer than Tom had ever heard it. "I am asking you to be yourself. Fear is a part of it, but you do not have to let it be the only part." He laid the rifle on a large, flat rock and stepped away, turning his back to the boy in a gesture of absolute trust. He began to walk back toward the house. He did not know if the boy would pick it up. He only knew that he could not force him. The choice had to be Tom's. He had almost reached the porch when he heard the shot. It was loud in the still afternoon air. He stopped, but did not turn around. A moment later, there was another shot. He waited. After a long silence, he heard footsteps behind him. Tom was standing there, the heavy rifle held carefully in his hands, pointed safely at the ground. The boy's face was still pale, but the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a quiet, shaky resolve. "I missed," Tom said, his voice hoarse, "both times." "It takes practice," Eli said, turning to face him. He looked past the boy, to the fence post in the clearing. The tin can was gone. Eli looked back at Tom, and for the first time, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. "But I think you hit what you were aiming for." The boy had not been aiming for the can. He had been aiming for the fear that had held him captive for years. And this time, he had not missed. A week later, Pete Sawyer rode over. He brought news and a warning. Surveyors for the railroad had been seen just south of Silver Fork. The railroad was coming. A ribbon of steel that would change everything, bringing more people, more money, and more trouble. But it was his other news that made the air grow cold. He had seen Jack Brennan that morning, riding the fence line that separated his property from Eli's. Brennan was not checking his own fences. He was just sitting on his horse, staring. He was not looking at the cattle or the house. His eyes were fixed on the creek, the artery of clear, cold water that flowed down from the mountains and gave life to Eli's land. That evening, as the sun went down, Eli walked to the edge of his property. He stood by the cottonwood trees where he had first made his bargain with Miriam. He looked at the creek, the water flowing dark and steady in the twilight. He was not just looking at water. He was looking at his future, at the life he was building, a life that was no longer just his own. In the distance, he could almost feel the predatory gaze of his neighbor. The covenant he had made with winter was holding, but he knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the greatest storm was yet to come. Jack Brennan did not send a messenger. He came himself, a week after the first snow had fallen and then melted, leaving the ground a muddy, treacherous mess. He rode a big black gelding that was as ill-tempered as its owner, and he was flanked by 2 ranch hands whose faces were hard and empty. He did not dismount, but sat his horse just beyond the new gate Eli and Tom had built, a self-appointed king surveying a territory he believed should be his. Eli was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat in the cold air. Miriam was on the porch, mending one of Tom's shirts, while the children were playing a quiet game with stones near the steps. At the sight of the riders, a stillness fell over the small yard. Miriam's hands stopped moving. Tom, who had been carrying water from the creek, set the buckets down and moved to stand closer to the house, his expression wary. Eli finished his swing, splitting a log cleanly in 2. He set the axe down with deliberate slowness and turned to face his neighbor. He did not walk toward the gate. He made Brennan look at him across the expanse of his own land. Brennan's lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth. "Ward," he said, his voice carrying easily in the thin air, "I see you have taken on some help, getting soft in your old age." Eli's face was a mask of stone. "I have what I need. Brennan's gaze slid past Eli to the porch, lingering on Miriam and the children for a moment too long. It was a look of appraisal, as if he were calculating the value of new assets. A man with a family, he said, his tone turning philosophical, has so much more to protect, so much more to lose. He paused, letting the words sink in. A winter in Montana can be a long, hard thing. Accidents happen. A stray spark, a patch of bad ice. A man has to be careful. The threat was as clear as the cold air they were breathing. It was not aimed at Eli, but at the new, fragile life that had taken root in his home. Eli felt a cold rage coil in his gut, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. I am always careful. Brennan, and I take care of what is mine. He took a step forward, and it was as if the ground itself had shifted. This is my land. You are not welcome here. Ride out. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes across the muddy yard. Brennan's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. He had expected a flash of temper, an angry retort he could use as an excuse to escalate things. Eli's cold, unshakable calm was more infuriating than any curse. With a final, contemptuous sneer, Brennan reined his horse around and, along with his men, rode away, their hooves churning the soft earth. Miriam had not moved from the porch. She had gathered Alice close to her, her hand resting on the child's shoulder. When Eli turned back, their eyes met. He saw no fear in her face, only a shared understanding of the danger that had just passed, and the danger that was still to come. He had stood between them and the threat, a human shield. The silent fortress had found something it was willing to fight for. The next 2 weeks were quiet, a tense, watchful peace. The cold deepened. A light, dusting of snow fell, clinging to the branches of the pines and outlining the dark furrows of the land in white. They worked, preparing for the siege of winter. But a new tension hummed beneath the surface of their daily routines. At night, Eli would often stand at the window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness, listening. The attack came on a moonless night, when the wind was moaning through the trees. It was the smell that woke him first, a sharp, acrid scent that cut through the familiar smells of wood smoke and pine. Smoke. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing his coat. As he threw open the door, the cold night air hit him, and he saw it. An angry, orange glow was illuminating the western edge of the clearing. The haystacks. He did not have to shout. The house was already stirring. Miriam was there, her face stark in the flickering light. Tom was right behind her, his eyes wide but his jaw set. "Tom, the buckets! The creek!" Eli commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "Miriam, get Alice somewhere safe, then soak every blanket we have." There was no panic, only a desperate, focused energy. The largest of the 3 haystacks was already a tower of fire, the flames leaping 20 feet into the air, devouring the dry winter feed with a terrible hunger. Sparks and burning embers rode the wind, a deadly rain that threatened the other stacks, the barn, the house itself. They fought the fire with a primal fury. Eli, his face blackened with soot, used a long pole to try and push the burning hay away from the untouched stacks, a desperate, almost hopeless task. Tom, his young body straining, ran back and forth from the creek, a human chain of one, sloshing buckets of icy water onto the embers that landed near the barn. Miriam worked with a terrifying calm. After leading a sleepy, frightened Alice to the root cellar, the safest place she could think of, she returned and began dousing the walls of the barn and the side of the house with the soaked blankets, creating a wet barrier against the flying sparks. Her mind was a cold, clear machine of calculation, assessing the wind, the direction of the fire, the most immediate threats. They were a small army of 4 against a raging enemy, and for a long time, it seemed they were losing. The second haystack caught, the fire leaping the gap with a triumphant roar. Eli felt a surge of despair. That hay was their cattle's life, It was their own survival through the long white months ahead. He looked at his small, desperate crew. He saw Tom, stumbling with exhaustion but refusing to stop. He saw Miriam, her hair coming loose from its bun, her face grim with determination as she beat out a small grass fire with a wet sack. And in that moment, a profound shift occurred deep inside him. As he looked at them, silhouetted against the terrible, beautiful flames, he realized with a clarity that shook him to his soul that his deepest fear was not for the hay. It was not for the barn. It was not even for the house he had built. It was for them. The thought of any harm coming to the woman working so fiercely, or the boy who had faced down his own demons, or the little girl huddled in the dark cellar, was a terror beyond any he had ever known. He was no longer a man defending his property. He was a man defending his people. With a renewed surge of strength, he yelled for Tom. Together, they abandoned the second haystack and focused all their efforts on the third, the smallest one, but the one closest to the barn. They worked side by side, a silent, perfectly coordinated team, throwing bucket after bucket of water, their movements economical and desperate. Slowly, miraculously, they began to gain ground. The wind shifted slightly, and the advance of the flames slowed. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the fire was out. They stood in the aftermath, 4 soot-stained figures in a landscape of devastation. 2 of the 3 haystacks were gone, reduced to smoldering, blackened piles. A quarter of their winter feed had vanished in a single night. The ground was a mess of ash and ice, the black stain of the fire a stark wound against the thin white of the snow. They had saved the barn. They had saved the house, but the cost had been immense. The next morning, as they were clearing the debris, they heard the sound of horses. Eli's hand went instinctively to the axe he was carrying, his body tensing. But it was not Brennan. It was Pete Sawyer, and behind him were 2 other ranchers, men Eli knew and respected. Pete swung down from his horse, his friendly face etched with concern. He looked at the blackened remains of the haystacks, and his expression hardened. "We saw the glow last night," he said, his voice grim. "Figured it was you. This was no accident." Eli just nodded, too exhausted to speak. "The West can be a hard place," Pete continued, his gaze sweeping over Miriam and Tom, who had stopped their work to watch. "But a man does not have to stand alone." He looked back at Eli. "Brennan has pushed folks around for too long. He thinks because he has the sheriff in his pocket, he can do whatever he wants. He is wrong." He gestured to the men behind him. "We will take turns. We will set up a night watch. He will not catch you alone again." Eli looked at the faces of his neighbors, at their simple, solid offer of support. For 10 years, he had kept this community at arm's length, convinced that solitude was strength. He had been wrong. In the face of a common enemy, they had come. They had not asked for anything in return. They had simply shown up. It was the code of the West, an unwritten law of mutual support that was more powerful than any statute on the books. He felt a lump form in his throat, and for the first time in a decade, he did not feel alone. The sense of community, however, could not protect them from the next blow. It came 3 days later, delivered by a sheepish deputy who seemed afraid to look Eli in the eye. It was a legal summons, a sheaf of papers filled with dense, formal language. Eli read it standing on his porch, the cold paper trembling slightly in his hand. Jack Brennan was suing him. The lawsuit was not about the fire. There was no proof. It was about something far more fundamental, far more dangerous. It was about his water rights. The suit claimed that the original survey of the Ward property, filed by Eli's father 30 years ago, contained a small but significant irregularity. It alleged that the rights to the main fork of the creek, the very water that Brennan had been staring at, did not, in fact, belong to Eli at all. It was a lie, a fabrication built on some forgotten clerical error, but in a courtroom presided over by a judge who owed his position to Brennan's influence, A lie could easily become the truth. The law, which should have been his shield, was being fashioned into a weapon to be used against him. That evening, the house was quiet. The weight of the lawsuit settled over them, a chill that was colder than the winter air outside. Eli sat at the table, staring at the papers, his mind racing. Lawyers cost money. A court battle could drag on for months, draining his resources, keeping him from the work that needed to be done. Brennan was trying to bleed him dry, to break him without ever firing a shot. Miriam came and sat opposite him. She had put the children to bed, and the house was still. She looked at the papers, then at his face. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She pushed it across the table toward him. He looked at it, then at her, his expression questioning. "It is a contingency fund," she said, her voice soft. "I have been saving it." He slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small stack of money. It was not a fortune, but it was more than a simple housekeeper could have saved. He looked at her, confused. "I knew a fight might be coming," she explained, her gaze steady. "A man like Brennan. He does not stop. I wanted to be prepared." She took a quiet breath. "I sold my mother's wedding ring when we were in Silver Fork. I knew we would need the money for something more important than a memory." Eli stared at the money, then at her empty hand. He thought of the small, embroidered bluebird on the dish towel, a relic of his own lost love. She had sold hers. She had sacrificed a piece of her past, a tangible link to her own history, for a future that was uncertain at best, a future with him. It was an act of faith so profound, so absolute, that it shattered the last of his defenses. It was more than a partnership. It was a pledge. He looked across the table at this gentle, unbreakable woman, and he knew that the battle for the water, for the land, for their very survival, was a battle they would fight together. The money from Miriam's sacrifice lay on the table between them, a small pile of currency that felt heavier than a stack of gold. It was a bond of trust, a silent testament to the fact that their arrangement had become something more than a contract for the winter. In the days that followed the deputy's visit, a new and determined quiet settled over the house. They were a garrison, besieged not by an army, but by the slow, grinding threat of the law and the malice of a single powerful man. They worked, they ate, they planned, and beneath it all, the unspoken truth of their shared fate bound them closer than any spoken vow. The first true storm of the season arrived without warning, a blizzard that swept down from the high peaks and smothered the world in a blinding fury of white. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house, and the snow piled in deep, silent drifts against the doors and windows. They were sealed in, an island of warmth in a frozen, howling wilderness. It was on the second night of the storm that the new crisis came, a danger from within that was more terrifying than any external threat. Alice grew sick. It had started with a listlessness in the afternoon, which Miriam had attributed to being cooped up indoors. But as evening fell, a fever began to burn in the little girl's cheeks. She had found a small cluster of wild berries a week before, nestled in a sheltered spot by the creek, their red skins bright against the first snow. Miriam had told her not to eat them, but the temptation for a sweet treat had been too much for a child. Now, as Alice tossed and turned in her small bed, her breathing shallow and ragged, Miriam's heart was seized by a cold, sharp terror. By midnight, the fever was raging. Eli, woken by Miriam's soft, urgent call, came to stand in the doorway of the small attic room. In the flickering lantern light, he saw the scene: Miriam bathing the child's forehead with a damp cloth, her face a mask of controlled fear, and the little girl, her skin unnaturally flushed, muttering deliriously. "It is the berries," Miriam whispered, her voice tight with guilt and desperation. I should have watched her more closely. Eli did not waste time with reassurance or blame. He felt the child's forehead. The heat was alarming. He looked at the window, where the snow was a solid, moving wall of white. "I am going for the doctor," he said, his voice flat and decisive. "You cannot," Miriam protested, her eyes wide with a new fear. "No one could ride in this. You will be lost." "The horse knows the way," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I know the storm." He was already moving, pulling on his heaviest coat and boots, his mind a cold, clear instrument focused on a single task. He saddled his most sure-footed horse in the dim light of the barn, the wind tearing at the doors as if it wanted to pull the building apart. The ride to Silver Fork was a nightmare of swirling snow and treacherous, hidden drifts. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him, and he navigated by instinct alone, by the feel of the land beneath his horse's hooves, by a deep, internal compass that had been honed by years of living in this unforgiving country. He was not just fighting the storm. He was fighting for the life of a little girl who had, without his permission, found her way into the locked corners of his heart. He reached Dr. Whitaker's house just before dawn, a figure of snow and ice, his beard frozen to his coat. The doctor, a gruff, no-nonsense man, took one look at Eli's face and began packing his bag. The ride back was even worse, a slow, brutal slog against the relentless wind. They found Miriam still at her post, her face pale with exhaustion, but her hands steady. The doctor's examination was swift and efficient. He confirmed it was a poison from the berries, something that had attacked the child's system with a terrifying speed. He administered a tincture that smelled of bitter herbs and gave Miriam instructions for the long hours ahead. "The fever needs to break by morning," the doctor said, his voice grim as he prepared to face the storm again. "If it does not, there is nothing more I can do." And then they were alone again, just the two of them and the small, struggling life in the bed. They began their vigil. The storm raged outside, but the world had shrunk to the confines of this one small room. They did not speak much. Words were useless against the magnitude of their shared fear. Instead, they communicated in a language of small, silent actions. He kept the fire in the small stove fed, ensuring a steady, even warmth. She continued to bathe Alice's face and hands, her touch infinitely gentle. When her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, he would silently place a cup of hot, strong coffee in her hand. When he would stare too long into the flames, his face a mask of grim tension, she would ask him a simple question about the cattle, pulling his mind back to the practical world, if only for a moment. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, as they both leaned over the bed, listening to the child's faint, shallow breathing, her hand brushed against his, she did not pull away. He did not move. For a long, timeless moment, their hands rested together on the rough woolen blanket, a small point of contact in a vast ocean of uncertainty. It was not a gesture of romance, but of something deeper, a shared burden, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this fight together, to the end. The fever broke with the dawn. It was not a dramatic change, but a slow, subtle easing of the terrible heat. Alice's breathing deepened, and she fell into a true, healing sleep. The storm outside had exhausted itself, the wind finally sighing into a weary whisper. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Eli stood looking out the window at the new, white world. He felt as if he had been through a fire and a flood all at once. He turned and looked at the three of them. Miriam was slumped in a chair, asleep, her face worn with care but peaceful for the first time in a day. Tom, who had kept a silent, stoic vigil of his own downstairs, had come up and was now standing by his sister's bed, his hand resting protectively on the frame. And Alice, her small face pale but calm, was sleeping. In that quiet, sunlit room, the last of his old vows crumbled to dust. He was not a solitary man. He was not an island. He was a part of this. He walked over to Miriam and gently touched her shoulder. She woke with a start, her eyes immediately going to the bed. He just nodded, and a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her face. He looked at her, then at Tom, then at the sleeping child. "We fight this together," he said, the words simple, but they were a new oath, spoken in the quiet aftermath of the battle they had just won. Later that day, when some semblance of normalcy had returned, Miriam came to him. She placed the small bundle of money on the table again. Then Tom came and stood beside her. He held out a small, tightly rolled wad of bills, the wages Eli had insisted on paying him for his work. "This is for the lawyer, too," the boy said, his voice cracking with the effort of his manhood. A moment later, Alice appeared, her movements still weak, but her eyes clear. She was carrying a small glass jar, and in it was a collection of pennies and a few small, shiny buttons. It was her entire worldly treasure. She held it up to him. "For the house," she whispered. Eli looked at the three of them, at the total, unconditional offering of their trust. They were giving him everything they had, not just their money, but their faith. He felt a profound sense of humility, a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He gently pushed their offerings back toward them. "Keep it," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He looked at Miriam, and the words he had never thought he would say again came to him, as natural and necessary as breathing. "This arrangement, it is not working." He saw the flicker of hurt and confusion in her eyes before he continued. "If we are going to defend this place," he said, his gaze holding hers, "if we are going to fight for this water and this land against Brennan, then let it not be my house we are fighting for." He took a breath. "Let it be our home." It was not a poetic proposal. There were no pretty words. It was a statement of fact, a practical, heartfelt offering of a shared life, a shared burden. It was the truest thing he had ever said. Miriam stared at him. Her lips parted in disbelief. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a sunrise after a long, dark night. She did not need to speak. Her answer was in her eyes. A few days later, Eli rode into town and went straight to the courthouse. He came back with a new page for the heavy, leather-bound ledger where he kept all the ranch's records. That evening, by the light of the fire, he opened it to the first page. At the top, in his father's old-fashioned script, it read, "The Ward Ranch." Beneath it, he wrote his own name. And then, he dipped the pen in the inkwell and slid the ledger across the table to Miriam. He pointed to the empty space beside his name. She picked up the pen, and with a hand that was only slightly trembling, she signed her name. Her letters clear and strong next to his. It was a contract of a different sort, a partnership not for a season, but for a lifetime. "A house should have flowers for a wedding," Alice said solemnly from her spot by the hearth. Tom, who was carving a piece of wood, grinned. "Flowers can wait for the spring, Alice, but a family cannot." The next week, they all rode to town in the buckboard. Pete Sawyer had seen them off, clapping Eli on the back. "I always said," the friendly rancher had mused, a twinkle in his eye, "that temporary is just fear wearing a practical coat. I am glad you finally took the coat off, Eli." The ceremony in the judge's chambers was brief and simple. The judge, a man who owed no favors to Jack Brennan, looked at the quiet, determined couple before him and the two serious children standing as witnesses, and he signed the papers with a decisive flourish. They were a family, bound by law as they were already bound by hardship and affection. As they stepped out of the courthouse and into the cold, bright sunlight, their path was blocked. Jack Brennan and two of his men stood there, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contempt. Brennan had clearly just heard the news. He looked from Eli to Miriam, his eyes filled with a venomous scorn. He let out a harsh laugh. "Well, Ward, I never thought you would be so desperate that you would have to legally bind your hired help. Tell me, is this included in her wages?" The insult was ugly and public, designed to strip Miriam of her dignity, to reduce their new life to a sordid business transaction. Eli did not say a word. He simply handed the reins of the buckboard to Tom, took one step forward, and drove his fist into Jack Brennan's sneering face. The sound was a sharp, satisfying crack. Brennan staggered backward, shock and pain in his eyes, a trickle of blood running from his lip. The battle of lawyers and lawsuits had just become a war of men. The line had been drawn, not in a courtroom, but in the dusty street of Silver Fork, with a single, brutal punch. The courtroom in Silver Fork was a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool. Winter had tightened its grip, and the potbelly stove in the corner glowed red, but it could not seem to chase the chill from the air. Jack Brennan sat beside his lawyer, a slick man from the territorial capital, and his expression was one of supreme confidence. He was a man playing a game in a room where he owned all the pieces. Eli sat beside Miriam at a small table, his big hands resting on his knees. He felt out of place, a man of open spaces and clear rules trapped in a world of whispers and hidden meanings. He had hired the only lawyer in town, a young man whose ambition was greater than his experience, and Eli could see the worry in the young man's eyes. Brennan's lawyer was smooth and sharp. He spoke of legal precedent and property law, his words weaving a complex web around a single, damning point, a supposed error in the original survey map filed with the land office 30 years prior. He presented the old, yellow document with a flourish, pointing out a faded line, a slightly ambiguous notation. It was a technicality, a speck of dust in the gears of the law, but he was blowing on it until it became a storm. He made it sound as if Eli's father had been a thief, a man who had knowingly stolen the rights to the most valuable water in the district. When the lawyer finished, a smug silence filled the room. The judge, a man known to enjoy Brennan's hospitality, looked down at Eli with a disinterested expression. It seemed a foregone conclusion. Then Miriam rose from her chair. She was not dressed in finery, only her plain, clean wool dress. She did not look at the judge or at Brennan's lawyer. She looked at the dozen or so ranchers and townspeople who had crowded into the small room, men like Pete Sawyer who had come to stand with one of their own. "Your Honor," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, filling the room with its quiet authority. "The law speaks of papers and lines on a map. I would like to speak of a life." She placed the heavy ranch ledger on the table with a solid thud. She opened it, its pages filled with her neat, precise script. "This is the record of the Ward Ranch since this past autumn," she explained. She spoke of expenditures, the new hinge for the gate broken in the hailstorm, the cost of the seed for a spring garden, the price of the extra wool for winter clothes for the children. She was painting a picture not of a property, but of a home, a place of work and investment and care. Then she unrolled a piece of canvas on the table. On it, she had drawn a map. It was not a surveyor's map, full of precise angles and legal notations. It was a map of the land as it was lived. Here was the spot where the old cottonwoods grew. Here was the high pasture where the cattle took shelter from the north wind. And here, drawn in a steady blue line, was the creek. She had marked every point where they drew water, for the house, for the livestock, for the small patch of land she planned to garden. She had noted the dates when the water had run high and when it had run low. It was a testament of use, a 30-year history of life depending on that water, a history that Brennan's dusty paper could not refute. Pete Sawyer was called to speak. He stood before the judge, a plain, honest man, and he spoke of Eli Ward. He spoke of a neighbor who was quiet but fair, a man who had never wronged anyone. He spoke of the fire and of the community that had rallied to help. His words were a powerful counterpoint to the lawyer's slick accusations. They were not about the law. They were about character. And in the West, character was often the highest court of all. The judge, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. He could no longer simply dismiss the case. He leaned back in his chair, his expression clouded with thought. The slick lawyer began to rise, to object, but the judge waved him to silence. The air in the room was thick with tension. That night, the snow began to fall again. Thick, silent flakes that muffled the world in a blanket of white. Pete Sawyer and another rancher, a man named Henderson, were taking the first watch. They sat in the cold darkness of the barn, a shared blanket over their knees, speaking in low whispers. The attack on the haystacks had taught them all a lesson. Brennan was a predator, and you did not leave your flock undefended. It was just after midnight when they saw them. 3 dark figures moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps silenced by the new snow. Brennan was overconfident, certain that one act of arson had been enough to terrorize his target. He did not expect a welcoming committee. Inside the house, Tom was awake. He had been sleeping fitfully, the tension of the day's court proceedings still humming in his nerves. He heard the faint crunch of a boot on a patch of icy snow, a sound that did not belong to the night. He crept to the window and peered out. In the faint, reflected light from the snow-covered ground, he saw the shapes moving toward the barn. His heart hammered against his ribs. He did not scream. He did not panic. Eli's lessons had taken root in him. He was not a fighter, not a killer. He was a protector. He thought of the rifle over the mantelpiece. But he knew that was not his role. He turned and ran. Not for a weapon, but for the heavy iron bell Eli had mounted on a post on the porch. A bell used to call the hands in from the far pastures in his father's day. The first shot came from the barn, a muzzle flash that briefly illuminated Pete Sawyer's grim face. It was a warning shot. Aimed high, the figures in the snow returned fire, their shots wild and angry, splintering the barn door. And then the night was shattered by a different sound, the loud, insistent clang of the bell, ringing out over and over again, a frantic, desperate alarm. Tom was pulling on the rope with all his might, the sound a physical blow against the silence, a cry for help, a declaration of defiance. The sound shocked Brennan and his men. They had counted on silence, on secrecy. The bell was an announcement of their failure, a summons to the entire valley. They hesitated, their dark purpose broken. That hesitation was all Pete and Henderson needed. They fired again, and one of Brennan's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. In the house, Eli had his rifle in his hand, moving toward the door. Miriam grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "Let the bell be our fight. Let the neighbors be our strength." He looked at her, at the wisdom and courage in her face, and he understood. To charge out into the night would be to meet violence with violence. To descend to Brennan's level, to trust in their community was a different kind of strength, a greater one. Outside, the fight was already over. Brennan, seeing one of his men down and hearing the distant shouts of other ranchers responding to the bell, knew he was trapped. He and his remaining men threw down their rifles and raised their hands in the air as Pete and Henderson cautiously approached. The cycle of violence had been broken not by a better aim, but by a boy with a rope and the sound of a bell ringing in the night. In the cold aftermath, the air smelled of gunpowder and pine. They stood in the yard, a small group of people bound together by the night's events. Brennan and his men were tied up, their faces sullen and defeated. Eli walked over to where Tom was standing by the bell, his small body trembling with adrenaline and relief. Eli put a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of profound pride and gratitude that needed no words. Miriam came and stood beside them, pulling a shawl tighter around her shoulders against the biting cold. She reached out and took Eli's hand, her fingers lacing through his. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the lanterns the other ranchers had brought. "A cowboy turned down every sweet bride in the county," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the cold air. She squeezed his hand, until he learned that a vow of solitude cannot keep you warm through the winter. He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down his ghosts, who had stood beside him in a courtroom and a fire, who had made his house a home. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered features. He felt a tightness in his throat, a swell of emotion so powerful it almost stole his breath. "I am not vowing solitude anymore," he said, his voice thick. The next morning, a small, grim procession rode into Silver Fork. Pete Sawyer and the other ranchers brought their prisoners to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man who had long enjoyed Brennan's patronage, tried to bluster and deflect, but he could not stand against the collective will of a dozen angry, armed, and respected landowners. They had caught Brennan in the act of attempted arson, of attempted murder. They were the witnesses. The community, awakened by the bell, was demanding justice. Faced with a choice between his wealthy patron and a full-blown citizen revolt, the sheriff made the only choice he could. He locked Jack Brennan and his men in the town's small jail cells. Later that day, word came from the judge. In light of the night's events, the civil case concerning the water rights was postponed indefinitely, pending a full and independent investigation by the territorial authorities. The winter was still long, and the future was still uncertain, but the balance of power in Silver Fork had shifted, not in a courtroom, but in the snowy yard of a small ranch, with the sound of a bell that had woken up the whole county. The end of a long winter in the Absarokas is not an event. It is a slow, grudging surrender. The snow does not vanish, but recedes, shrinking away from the sun-warmed south faces of the hills, lingering stubbornly in the shadows. The world begins to speak again in a language of water, a constant, gentle dripping from the eaves of the house, the gurgle of the creek as it swells with the meltwater, the soft sucking sound of mud under a boot heel. For the first time in months, the air carried not the sharp, sterile scent of ice, but the rich, damp perfume of thawing earth. Inside the house on the Ward Ranch, a similar thaw was taking place. The silence that Eli had once cultivated as a shield was gone, replaced by the small, ordinary sounds of a life being lived. The clink of a spoon against a coffee cup, the soft scratch of Tom's pencil as he practiced his letters at the table, the sound of Alice humming as she arranged her collection of treasures on the kitchen windowsill. Her museum of hope now held the fool's gold from Morrison's store, the white quartz from the creek, and a dozen other smooth, colorful stones, each one a memory of a day they had survived. Her laughter, once a rare and timid thing, now echoed off the log walls, a sound as bright and welcome as the returning sun. Eli had changed. The transformation was not in his words, for he remained a man of few, but in the space he occupied. He no longer seemed to be guarding the edges of his own life. He had moved to its center. He would sit at the long table for breakfast, not in his customary solitude, but with his family, listening as Miriam planned the day's work. He would talk with her about which fields to leave fallow and which to graze, not giving orders, but seeking her counsel. Her name was in the ledger beside his, and he treated her as the full partner she was. He found himself looking for her in a room, his gaze drawn to the quiet strength in her face, a silent conversation passing between them that needed no sound. He had spent a decade believing that love was a vulnerability, a target for fate. He was learning, day by day, that it was an anchor, the only thing that could hold a man steady in a storm. Miriam, in turn, had blossomed in the security of their shared home. The weary, guarded woman who had stepped down from a dusty wagon in Silver Fork was gone. In her place was the matriarch of the Ward Ranch, a woman whose hands were gentle with a sick child but firm in the running of a household. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. She had found a man who did not see her as a burden or a prize, but as an equal. The constant, low-grade fear that had been her companion for so long had finally receded, and in its place, a quiet, joyful confidence had taken root. She was learning to let herself be loved, to believe that she was worthy of a safe harbor after so many years at sea. Tom had grown a full 2 inches over the winter, but the change in him was more than physical. The defensive, watchful boy had become a capable young man. He worked alongside Eli, his movements mirroring the older man's economy and skill. He could mend a fence, read a brand, and predict the weather with a surprising accuracy. The fear of his past had not vanished, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned the difference between the brutal, unpredictable anger of his father and the quiet, steady strength of the man who was now his guide. He had learned that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the discipline and responsibility to act in spite of it. He had found his place, not as a guest or a hired hand, but as the son of the house, with a future that was tied to the land beneath his feet. The final resolution of their conflict with Jack Brennan came not with the roar of a gun, but with the quiet turning of the wheels of justice. In early April, a surveyor from the territorial capital arrived in Silver Fork. He was an impartial man with a transit and a set of official maps, a representative of a West that was slowly being tamed by rules and regulations. He spent 2 days on the Ward property, driving new stakes, taking measurements, and making careful notes. He was polite, professional, and immune to the pressure that Brennan's money had always been able to exert on local officials. His report, filed a week later, was unequivocal. The original survey was sound. The creek and the rights to its water belonged to the Ward Ranch, just as they had for 30 years. Brennan's lawsuit, the weapon he had fashioned to ruin them, was dismissed. The news of Brennan's own fate followed shortly after. Faced with the unshakable testimony of Pete Sawyer and the other ranchers who had formed the Night Watch, and the evidence of his own men who testified against him in exchange for lighter sentences, Brennan was convicted. He was found guilty of conspiracy, destruction of property, and assault with a deadly weapon. The judge, no longer beholden to a man who had lost all public support, sentenced him to 10 years in the territorial prison. There was no bloody showdown, no final, dramatic confrontation. His reign of greed and intimidation was ended by the simple, powerful act of a community standing together, a testament to the fact that the true strength of the West lay not in the hands of its bullies, but in the linked arms of its decent, hard-working people. One warm spring evening, as the last of the sun's light painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, the four of them sat on the steps of the front porch. A gentle breeze drifted down from the high country, and the iron bell that hung from a post nearby chimed softly. It was no longer an alarm, but a wind chime, the quiet, melodic voice of their home. On the steps below them sat 4 pairs of boots, 2 large and 2 small. They were caked in the rich, dark mud of the spring fields, a testament to a day of shared labor. They had spent the afternoon together, planting the first rows of the kitchen garden. It was a promise of the harvest to come, an act of faith in the future. Eli looked at his family. He saw Alice, her head leaning against her mother's knee, her eyes heavy with a happy, peaceful sleep. He saw Tom, whittling a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration, a young man at ease in his own skin. And he saw Miriam, her hand resting on his, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon, her expression one of profound peace. She had taken off her wedding ring, a simple, unadorned band of gold, while she worked in the dirt. She had tied it with a piece of twine to the top of a small wooden stake that marked the row of newly planted beans. It glinted in the last of the light, a small, golden promise tied to the earth. It was a promise made not of grand words, but of hands and soil, of shared work and a shared life. Eli finally understood. The fortress of solitude he had built to protect himself from pain had also been a prison, starving him of the very thing that made a life worth living. Courage was not walling yourself off from the world. Courage was opening the door. He looked at the woman beside him, at the children who were now his own, and he knew, with a certainty that filled every part of him, that he was finally, truly home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight, and we would love to connect with all of you. So please comment with where you are listening from so we can all share in this experience together. Subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and video can be heard by more people.